Hi. Hi, we're going to get started here. I'm going to pass the mic over to Kevin Heslop, who is going to be the moderator of this wonderful panel. Thank you for all coming. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional territories that we're gathered on, the territories of the Attawaddaran, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Lenni Lenape. We're here in this beautiful room overlooking this beautiful river. Its original name was Dushkan Zibi, meaning Antler River, and this river flows through our community, connecting us to each other and to the land, but it also flows downstream and connects us to the First Nations that are neighbors to London, Chippewa, the Thames First Nation, Munsee, Delaware of the Nation, Chippewa, the Thames First Nation, Oneida First Nation of the Thames, and Munsee, Delaware Nation. And then if you take the Thames even further, a little further along, you get to Moravian First Nation, which is about an hour and a half, 45? Okay. I was biking, I guess. So welcome everyone here today, and I bring up the river because it flows through our town, and it reminds us of our responsibilities to the land, and reminds us also of our responsibility to the original land protectors and water protectors of these territories. I am very pleased to tell you about a partnership that Words has with Poetry in Voice. Poetry in Voice is a national poetry recital competition that takes place across Canada, and I've been fortunate enough to be a judge. My name's Tom Cull, by the way, if I did not introduce myself. I've been fortunate enough to be a judge in one of these competitions, they happen in high schools, and students can go on there's a website, and they can choose a poem and learn it, and then take it and recite it at a competition. And it starts off at the regional levels, and if you win, you go up and up and up and up. And today we're joined by Matthew Zoe, who placed second at the Nationals last year. He's a graduate of London Central. And he is going to get us started here today, he is going to come down and recite the poem that he took to the Nationals and came in second place. So come on down, Matthew. Please welcome Matthew Zoe.
Poem for Duncan Campbell Scott by Armand Garnet Ruffo. Canadian poet who had a long and distinguished career in the Department of Indian Affairs, retiring in 1932. The Penguin Book of Canadian Verse. Who is this black coat and tie? Christian severity etched in the lines he draws from his mouth. Clearly a noble man who believes in work and mission. See how he rises from the red velvet chair, rises out of the boat with the two Union Jacks fluttering like birds of prey, and makes his way towards our tents. This man looks as if he could walk on water, and for our benefit probably would, if he could. He says he comes from Ottawa way, Odawa country, comes to talk treaty and annuity and destiny, to make the inevitable less painful, bearing gifts that must be had. Notice how he speaks aloud and forthright. This or nothing. Beware. Without title to the land under the crown, you have no legal right to be here. Speaks as though what has been long decided wasn't. As though he wasn't merely carrying out his duty to God and King, but sincerely felt. Some whisper this man lives in a house of many rooms, has a cook and a maid, and even a gardener to cut his grass and water his flowers. Others don't like the way he's always busy writing stuff in the notebook he carries. Him. He calls it poetry and says it will make us, who are doomed, live forever.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Tom. Thank you all for being here. We're going to begin with readings from our featured poets, and then we're going to have a chat. So, our first reader, D.A. Lockhart, is the author of The Gravel Lot That Was Montana with Mansfield Press in 2018, This City at the Crossroads, Black Moss Press in 2017, and Big Medicine Comes to Erie, Black Moss Press in 2016. His work has received multiple Pushcart Prize nominations. He is the publisher at Urban Farmhouse Press, a Turtle Clan member of the Moravian of the Thames First Nation. Lockhart currently resides at Wawiatanong on the south shore of the Detroit River, most often referred to as the border cities of Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. Please welcome Daniel.
Kulamosi, as we say in Bucktown, or Kweklau, or what's going on. Real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. The whole time change is really playing games with me. And it's a real special treat for me to have the Antler River outside here. As you know, it flows right past Moravian Town. I was actually born in Chatham. Before being airlifted here, I survived, obviously, and before you now. But the river is a very important place for me. All rivers are in a lot of ways. I have a very strong spiritual connection to the White River in Indiana, to the Detroit River in Windsor, Detroit, Wawiatanong. Thank you for saying that. That was awesome. And obviously the Thames River. So I don't want to talk too much about this. Our time is somewhat limited today. So let's get to poetry, right? That's what we're all here for. For those of you who don't know, my book, Devil in the Woods, has been brought out by Brick Books. And it's a collection of letter and prayer poems from Anishinaabe, a guy from Curve Lake, Ontario, to famous Canadians, and prayer poems to our everyday life. So as I was sitting in the hotel room last night and watching hockey, because that's what you do in Canada on Saturday nights, I had Don Cherry come on my screen. And I've been asked to read, and I will, a letter to Cherry from Dennis Crowfeather's garage at Curve Lake. Dear Don, it's been some time since last time we saw eye to eye on anything. Maybe it goes all the way back to big paychecks and Rocky Mountain highs. Maybe it's locked up in that eagle strut of your powwow-infused fancy dancing outfits showcased coast to coast Saturday nights. Every eyeball-busting thread makes me understand that most of us share the need to strut the goods that Creator gave us as we turkey-step our lives on the old turtle's back. Old Dennis and I were taking in the Battle of Ontario in his Curve Lake garage when you came flashing through a bad bead hold and started hollering about Bobby Orr and knowing your past and the importance of face-punching a guy when the right moment comes. And damned if we didn't talk about the Ojek boys, the time the Ojek boys roughed up the Kahnawake fancy dancers at Silver Lake a couple years back. Cree boys rained down snow like it was the last week of November, and did it because they swore Edna Puskamoose lost the grass dance final on account of a stick being left in the circle by one of their boys the previous round. Grapes, you gotta know that Eastern powwows play heavier than an Adams Division final. Intent in any competition is only an eighth of any penalty. Old Dennis and I laughed like the powwow spectators we are, both knowing that Edna had the grace of a blind heron, and it's easier to think well enough of taking a shot or 12 to the head, so long as your suit makes you look like a lake showing off to the world, and the best things you ever did were 30 years before you started hollering advice into the night. Anyways, We are nothing without linesmen who talk quick enough to keep us honest and ensure that second late game hits the air before the V-hold breaks for good. JW. I had read that one on CBC, and the commentator looked at me and said, "Do you send that to Don Cherry? I think he'd really like it." I was like, no, he wouldn't. So there are prayer poems in here as well. And often I don't drive as much as I used to. And London, I used to live in Peterborough. And I would go back home and visit my family in Windsor. And the 401 is, of course, the notorious speed trap. But for Windsorites, London is the notorious speed trap. So I had to run two gauntlets. One was in London and one was on the old Highway 105 going up to Peterborough. So this one kind of also plays to London as well. But this was prayer that the OPP officer was opening Timbits. We offer up to you these prayers, given that rapidly reducing highway speeds, that the uniformed occupants of that median pulled-out cruiser hath found themselves momentarily lost in wafts of powdered sugar and sparkling glisten awe for leftover donut sweet dough. Let us pray that they slowly caress individual Timbits with tender, searching fingertips, their gaze fixed upon the future pleasure of tongue-melting sugar. In those moments, we pray, may the flashing double-digit excess of our highway speed go unnoticed, like all the sufferings of First Nations to uniformed men. Let the sugar promises afforded by sweet dough obfuscate our passing northwards towards home. And what a wonderful poem that we had heard to start the afternoon off. And it's funny, I haven't actually heard Duncan Campbell Scott, the devil. I haven't heard his name in a long time since I had actually come to London, and it's been sort of percolating around. And one of the first poems I had wrote for this collection was a letter to Duncan Campbell Scott. And when you give it to Americans, they're like, what? I went to school in Indiana, and they were mostly confused by me. So this is one of the poems I really did a good job confusing to them. A letter to Campbell Scott from upstate New York. You may know, before I read this, the medicine line is what we refer to as the border. Sitting Bull had declared that the medicine line was a transformational border, that you're one thing on one side and something on the other. So that's the one bit of information you should know for this. Letter to Campbell Scott from upstate New York. Dear Duncan, you'd expect nothing less of me than dropping you a note from south of the medicine line. And yeah, sure, that's some load you'd expect to hear from a High Plains Indian. But hell, not like you could tell many of us apart. Old Belaney even had Bucktown all turned over. We thought white guys being Indians was the only way to be indigenous around here. Kind of like thinking that driving a rumble seat Ford was just First Nations enough for any of us. We landed into a county fair here. The town center crisscrossed as if by rosary beads with those American Pop-Tart Technicolor light bulbs. It reminded me of a vision you once had of a powwow suited for the modern Indian. All fluorescent rhinestones, Charlie Pride, and R.C. Cola. So here we are. Yancey and I got lost by some historic buildings. Problem is, windows become mirrors without something burning from the inside. Around here, we have no need for lights in empty buildings. It's funny how reflections of ourselves can play tricks on us. Thankfully, Yancey has a good nose for finding food tents. Real modern-day hunter-gatherer he is. We made it out into the street just in time for the sparklers. There's something about 7-day, three-county deep fryer grease that makes all of us think about treaty rights and elected band councils. But this here is America, right? And what self-respecting man of the crown would follow what these lot would do? Funnel cakes are one thing, fry bread and farm equipment something completely. Anyways, just wanted to let you know both Yancey and I will be renewing our band cards after we cross the medicine line. Just hope your boys in uniform recognize our need to drift through hand-drawn lines without paper sails in our pockets. JW. And I'm going to leave you on this. I went to Winnipeg as part of this book tour, and the thing I loved about Winnipeg is everywhere you go, you can get bannock. It's like, I grew up as an urban Indian, so not getting bannock. And by the way, if you go to Bucktown, please avoid the corn soup and their bannock. It's more of a threat than anything else, than food. So let me give you this, and this is something I dream about. I messed up bannock for Thanksgiving. So this is prayer for the perfect bannock. Believe that white flower is our refuge and strength. With it we shall not fear, though our fish and game be removed from our land, our children taken by mounty edicts. Yet may our rendered protest find rest in the dull glisten of oil as it churns in cast iron with a bubbly roar coaxed to tempest by fingertips spurned water droplets. Let this rise, our vapors of hot grease, heavy with the sweetness of white flour mush turned to gold. Rise to meet Indian Affairs approved ceilings, that this perfect bannock shall chase our fear, numb our memories of what we can't have, remind us of the sweetness of our children. Though these walls shake with winds between fronts, we give thanks for sweet biscuit scent that makes glad the unceded territory between these walls, the holy place of roundhouses, sweat lodges, and Thursday night bingo. In flipping the perfect bannock, golden like the first light on spruce tree tips, may we know that our ancestors struggled forward for this, thankful not for what is done, nor content for what may come, but gratified that in this moment, the Bequajigan warm between fingertips is redolent of the world creator intended for us. Anushik for listening.
Thank you, Daniel. Wild Matter is Brenda Leifso's third book of poetry, following Baron the Fury with Peddler Press in 2015 and Daughters of Men Brick Books in 2008, which was shortlisted for the Ottawa Book Awards. Her poetry has been published in journals and anthologies across Canada, won the Banff Centre Bliss Carman Poetry Award, and has been short and long listed for the CBC Literary Prize. She is a freelance editor and an occasional academic instructor. She also runs her own yoga business. She lives gratefully near the shores of Lake Ontario in Kingston, Ontario. Please welcome Brenda.
Thank you. It's been I just find November takes me by surprise because October, at least where I am now, tends to be beautiful. And so just last week I was sitting outside in my backyard working, trying to drink in the sun as much as I could because I knew it was going to fade soon. So the first poem I'm going to read as soon as I can find it, it was marked, is called Sun. If you live until 80, I will herald every one of your 29,000 mornings, just as every jaundiced baby ever placed near a window has heralded me. I will lengthen and strengthen your bones, bleach them. I will take all credit for your anticipation of seasons, your creatureliness, your pause on a warm rock to take your boots off, to dig through the trail mix for the M&Ms. I will be the bite of the deer fly at the ankle and the shoulder blade. While it's true, I am responsible for navigation, accurate and errant, for the unmoved execution of human pride. I am also the author of the tree under which Buddha sat, of yoga's signature move, the masculine ordering of the universe, but also juice restrained and slurpable under the apple skin. The blisters on the castaway's lips and the peeling burn of childhood, tomatoes in August, the cicada scratching his back against the heat, flies on poop, a dog stretched out in September grass, a squirrel peeling chestnuts on the stoop, the last cricket packing up his violin, someone somewhere stretching herring on a rack. November's dogged rising, even if the hours are shorter or longer or brutal, even if October's pockets were loaded with stones. December, the concurrence of snowblindness and cinnamon trees. And this book is very seasonal, so it moves through seasons. It starts actually in October. The October I moved to Kingston was actually a terrible October. It rained all the time. And I had moved from Ottawa where there's a lot more sun, and so the lake effect in Kingston was a big surprise to me. So the book is quite seasonal. It moves through the seasons on an emotional and philosophical level as well. And so because we're in kind of autumn verging into winter, I'm going to read some of the autumn poems. And a lot of these poems, again, do arise from me actually sitting out in my backyard. This one is called September. September, and dear God, it's about time you remembered to fill the feeder, tisk the chickadees, the first to arrive. Church ladies with their casseroles, all gossip and bustling their way in to put the coffee on for the cardinals, the purple finches, the nuthatch with the nervous feet. And then I was driving back, my family was driving back along Highway 15 from Ottawa to Kingston at one point in time, and I am not joking, for miles and miles, there was hundreds of thousands of frogs on the road. It was the weirdest thing that I probably have ever seen, and I think it was this time of year, it was late October, and it was a beautiful warm day, and I think they were actually getting the heat from the asphalt and just soaking up the sun. However, it was kind of like a death wish. And it also made me think of, if you've ever watched the TV show 6 Feet Under, and this scene is always emblazoned in my mind where there's a very evangelical person driving a car, and she gets in a car accident with a van that's carrying a bunch of inflatable dummies. And the inflatable dummies all start rising up into heaven, and she thinks it's Armageddon. So somehow that and this poem are linked in my mind. Christie Lake Road. Late October, late afternoon, late in the pause, the sun takes on Sundays to drive the back roads home. Tires humming, the bass notes of summer, to the lakes, to the chicory, to the grand standing maple leaves, to the frogs on the asphalt, crouched by the thousands like tired evangelicals croaking in tongues. Uh, 3 o'clock October. Half an hour until the school bus brings the children home. Water boils in the kettle and the dog tickety-ticks into the kitchen. My heart is busy sawing a butter knife across my ribcage in its low-paying afternoon shift work of despair while the chickadees gossip in the yard. They pause once in a while to assess and argue the flight risk to the feeder until, fuck it, one of them can't help but dive. All the world fluting through her feathers for the promise of beak versus shell, the satisfying, determinate crack of splitting open. And I had the good fortune to do some yoga teacher training shortly after we moved to Kingston, and my instructor got us into the anatomy lab at Queen's, which was quite fascinating. So I'll read one called Anatomy Lab and then a follow-up from that based on a video we watched. Anatomy Lab. It is like this: a body under a sheet, skin peeled away, its muscle fibers like ship ropes, the tendons squid-like consistency. It is the uterus opened, the penis slack on the thigh, the blackened toe tips, the hoary nails that needed cutting a year ago. It is the bluish pockets of air pollution in the lungs, the papery heart scooped out of the chest cavity by undergraduate hands. It is the licorice of nerves running under the collarbone, the actual lens of an eye. But before that, it was my son stumbling into my bed in the mornings, throwing his arm across my chest, and what strange feet of fire danced on the surface of my heart. And because we are moving very quickly, well, actually, yes, we moved. So it's going to get dark today at like 4:30, just so you know. And so when I was doing my yoga teacher training, we also watched this video of an anatomist in the States, and he cuts horizontally so that the relationship between fascial tissue and skin and muscle, all of that is better understood. And this is how I feel when November rolls around. It's called 4 o'clock November. Is the anatomist cutting horizontally, one fiber after another, until from daylight the body has been perfectly peeled. I think that's it. Thank you.
Maybe you can take the center and I'll take you.
I'm taking the center.
Yeah, you can take the center.
Everyone knows I sit in the left. No.
Yeah,
I'm teasing.
we'll move all 3 stools to the left.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sit in the river.
I think I've got, maybe this will, yeah? Do I need one of these as well?
That's not going into speakers.
Okay.
Some pop singer.
Okay, so thank you both, first of all, for reading. I thought we might begin sitting as we are in the midst of a literary festival whose intention is to rediscover Southwesto identities. Whether I could draw forth from both of you how you think of identity and the way in which that informs your writing.
Me start?
Yeah, sure, if you like.
Okay, good, we're on. Well, I mean, identity, it's a nebulous thing in a big way. I think I'll go back. When I was 16, I found out I was Indigenous. Although I was going to the res and my father, that he looked Indigenous. But it never really dawned on me. He slapped the card in my hand and said, "This is your card. You're Lenape." I was like, "Oh, well, that's cool." So that wasn't a town we're going to? No, that was a res. Oh, that's cool. Why are we singing Christian songs? Don't ask questions. So it definitely plays into it, and I think as a writer, I was definitely very strongly encouraged at Indiana University to explore my identity. It backfired a couple times, for sure, but it's everything, I would say. As an Indigenous writer, I think it's really important for us to put our voices of our cultures out into the world. Oftentimes, and less so perhaps with this book, although there are some uses of Indigenous language in there, I think that just putting them in print matters immensely, because my identity is fundamentally tied with the struggles of my community, and I need to go into the world and hold that identity high and proud. At the same time, don't use it as a weapon, but use it as a healing instrument for everyone around us. I think that's a good start.
I think my writing is absolutely linked to identity, but an identity that I struggle with, both on a personal level and on a greater structural level. I would consider most of my writing of a fairly feminist nature, but not from a theoretical feminism, but actually from a practical feminism. So the things that confine women on a practical level every day. And that's what this book struggles with quite a bit, is coming to terms with how to be in the world and how to live within those structures at the same time you really want them torn down. But I don't know what to replace them with. This is kind of the crux of where I feel like I am in my life right now, and I also feel like the identity of mother is problematic. And to be honest, I think that in the literary scene, it is not a privileged identity to hold. So.
On that point, I wonder, as images of children recur throughout your collection, Brenda, whether you could discuss, if this is not too personal a question, the way in which your identity was enriched, maybe complexified as you move through the beginnings of and into motherhood and how that informed your work?
I think anybody who has kids that knows that as soon as you have kids, like all your faults come up to the surface. And not only your faults, but your unresolved issues from your old childhood. They start echoing and you're like, I'm never going to do what my mom did. And you're like, I just said what my mom said. Like, but I think that that's also a good thing because it's a harrowing, it's a winnowing of you're forced to be a better person day after day after day, and your failures are so in your face, and yet your children, and I'm hoping they continue to forgive me as they go into their adulthoods. They're not there yet, but you know, I've got a 13-year-old, so it is absolutely enriching. It does make me a better person, but it's much more complex than that too, on a psychological and a historical and a family structure way. And I did hear something on the radio the other day, how we exist in a time frame that's 200 years ago and 200 years in the future. And our actions today reverberate from 200 years ago, but also will have reverberations 200 years in the future. So that's a big responsibility.
Daniel, this collection with brick books oscillates in its form between prayers and letters, as we heard in your reading earlier. And I was wondering if you talk a little bit about the genesis of those two forms, how you came to them, and how they complement one another in the book.
Good question. Well, so the genesis of the idea of the book itself comes from my time in Montana. I studied at Montana State University, and I was part of a poetry group out there. It's what really sort of drove me to become a writer. And Richard Hugo is the great Montana writer from Missoula, Montana. He helped really sort of get the U of M creative writing program off the ground. And he wrote a collection of letter poems and letter and dream poems. So 31 letters and 13 dreams. So I really based it on that. However, speaking of identity, if I started using dreams, that would be way too stereotypical Indian, right? Like, everyone's like, oh man, you're Native, can you interpret my dreams? I mean, I don't know how many times I heard that living in Indianapolis. So I wasn't gonna go down that road. And it was something I was working on a little bit at IU with some prayer poems as well. So I came to the idea of religion and identity and what we use every day as Indigenous people. So a lot of the intent of the collection was to create a conversation between an average sort of working class, blue collar kind of Indigenous guy and the biggest names in sort of Canadian culture and history. And, you know, I follow the old ways. I was sent to Catholic school because my dad wanted a job on the Catholic school board. And I suffered through grade school and high school. And I really am not the religious type in that sense. So I wanted to, but yet I pray. So let me put it that way. I pray often. And often it's the prayers that I want answered are like, am I going to win the 50-50 draw at this hockey game? Or am I going to actually get like something more than potato wedges at Tim Hortons on roll up the rim to win? Or is that OPP officer going to ignore me today? Those are the things that I find myself praying for every day. Mm-hmm. And I think that the collection is trying to, obviously there's a lot of more highbrow sort of Indigenous writing that's trying to bridge a gap. And I wanted to create something that creates the dialogue with the sort of power ruling, you know, stereotypes of Canada, but does it so from a very sort of rooted speech and experience.
Speaking of rootedness, Brenda, throughout the book, it feels as if often the narrator is having a difficult time returning to a kind of embodied experience. The first poem of the collection is titled, I've Got to Stop Thinking, which I suppose could also be expressed, I've got to stop thinking, you know, like some kind of, so I wonder if you could say a word about how yoga has informed that ability to return to center.
Yes, I can. Would you like a lecture? So I had taken yoga teacher training in 2005 when I still lived in Vancouver, and weirdly I knew I had to do that in order to become a mother, just to be able to start dealing with my own stuff. And then when we moved to Kingston, there were years in between there in which I had 3 kids and put my husband through school and was working full time. And I was a little bit burnt out when we moved to Kingston, and there was a yoga studio down the street from me, and she was offering yoga teacher training. And again, it was something that it didn't make sense for me to take it on. It was expensive, it was time, but I knew I had to do it. And my yoga teacher said to me, I said, oh, well, because I have a dog. I'm like, I have to take I spend some time outside every day walking the dog, thinking. And she's like, you think too much. And it's true. I think too much. And it is hard when you're in the brain. How many of you have ever thought your way into happiness, right? Probably not a lot of people. But the body is one of the ways to access the mind. And so actually what she told me to do is to put on, when I went for a walk, because I had to do it every day, because I have a dog, is to put on some music that has a very strong rhythm, because that rhythm works with your cerebellum, which is working with your walking pace. And studies have actually shown that reduces anxiety, alleviates symptoms of depression. So music is a very powerful tool. And then you combine that, and that was my yoga practice. Mm-hmm. So yoga practice isn't necessarily just doing poses. Yoga practice is a way of learning to be curious and some self-insight and to be in the world. So I would always leave one earphone in and take the other one out and listen to the music of what was around me, because I grew up on the West Coast, and Lake Ontario feels like that kind of healing body of water for me. And it talks differently at different stages throughout the year. Like, it has different sounds. And so the sound of the wind, the sound of snow, that is an embodied presence in the world. And I think it's one of the only ways that people can learn to be in the world and be happy in the world.
Seasons are a kind of embodied presence too. And I wonder if you could offer a word or two about how seasons came to govern, maybe sounds too strong, but inform the trajectory of the book.
I was reading, so the year I wrote the book, I was also reading a whole lot of stuff. And I mean, my natural bent is towards lyric poetry, nature poetry, kind of philosophical thought around nature. And I think just the rhythm of life as it is for me is just itself very seasonal. I mean, we have kids, and so Halloween's a big deal, Christmas is a big deal, summer is a big deal. Mm-hmm. I also try and get my kids outside as much as possible. So I'm out with my dog at least an hour or two every day. So it's hard not to just have that infuse what you're doing, mm-hmm. when that is a part of your everyday. And also, I mean, I purposely wrote this book in more of a conversational tone, inspired by Mary Oliver, because Mary Oliver, I mean, people can say what they want about a level of sophistication. I don't care, because Mary Oliver speaks to the heart, and the world speaks to the heart. So those were the connections I was trying to make there.
Before I turn it over to you, if any of you have questions you'd like to offer these two brilliant poets. Daniel, I wonder if, on the point of speaking to the heart, you could elaborate a bit upon the importance for you of putting in, maybe unfortunately universally in Canada, recognizable things like the roll up the rim and icons who are mentioned in the interest of interrogating them and subverting them, but things that are, at any rate, recognizable rather than obscure.
Good question. And I think one of the things that often comes about when we talk about Indigenous writers or even Indigenousness in Canada is the separation, the us and them. And that to me has always been very incredibly problematic. I grew up in a Canadian city. My heroes and the people I watched every day, obviously my close relations were Indigenous, but they weren't. So I had to watch Al Waxman every day on King of Kensington at 4 in the afternoon. Very entertaining. Also, definitely watching hockey. Tim Hortons. I'm trying to remember everything that's sort of in there. Al Purdy. A lot of it becomes sort of my relationship with Canada, but in the way that I want to say that the vast majority of Indigenous people in Canada live in cities, and we experience Canadian culture. How we experience it is slightly different, and to create that dialogue was really important. And what this was is a way to sort of share with non-Indigenous Canadians that we have these relationships. They're very heartfelt. They're very problematic in some senses. But even looking at Don Cherry and saying, dude, you dressed like you're going to a powwow as a fancy dancer. I wouldn't want to see Don Cherry dance. Maybe I would. Maybe it'd be really something viral on YouTube. But he would be... we recognize, we approach everything in our own terms. So, yeah, Bannock's killing us. So is baloney. But guess what? I like both of those things. Obviously in moderation. But I think that's part of the thing. Like, poetry should be able to, or any sort of writing should be able to engage. I'm not here to separate us. We've all been separated enough. And the point is to draw bridges now.
Are there any questions from the audience? Sir.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thanks very much for coming in and sharing your writing with us. My question is, I'm kind of curious about something. When there's not a huge readership for poetry, for book sales, for poetry, so when you're sitting down and you're getting started, you've got an idea in your head. How do you imagine your reader or your listener? And I have to go back to that idea. When you know the readership or the listeners are so few, do you have a type, or do you have a constituency or a group that you're imagining as you sit down and do this?
Well, I think that I don't know. I like to consider it as a conversation. And like I was saying about Mary Oliver before, the reason Mary Oliver has staying power is because there's something about her writing that is so both human and reflective of something greater that it touches people who don't read poetry at all. Anybody who reads a Mary Oliver poem can get some kind of that spirit from it. And so I was trying to think of that, just trying to stay actually away. Some of my other books have been a little bit more intellectual, and the response has been completely different to this book because people can actually understand it. So there's something to be said for that. So I do actually think of people, and I think, like, I've had people do it in their book group. And I had someone email me the other day and said people were doing it was a group of women. Women are the ones usually in book groups. My demographic, they were like crying and laughing. And so that is what I would hope that any kind of writing I were to do did. So, yeah.
Well, okay, I'll start with this. I'm a publisher as well. So I often only think about audience in terms of my publishing business. When it comes to me writing, it's something I have to do. And what comes out is sort of like a mask. I mean, a lot of folks get to do stuff like they get to dance or they get to drum. By the way, I have the worst sense of rhythm. I got kicked out of my drum group because I was so bad. But at least I could tell a good joke every now and again. However, I don't often think about the audience. And I mean, it doesn't mean I don't always not think of the audience. That's some really strange construction I just put out in the world. But I know that in terms of what I write, I cross the border often. Obviously, being trained in the United States, I have a different sort of audience there. So I definitely play a mask. I put a mask on when I go to, say, Indiana or Michigan. When I do readings, or Illinois, I read like an American. I have to sort of tone down the Canadianness. So I understand that. But poetry, while it's on the page and you have to sell it on the page, this is what we have to do. Poetry is a performed art. Touring is part of the deal. We have to stand up in front of people. We have to go on the air. We do whatever we can. It's a tough audience, but you know what? It is for everybody else. Write a novel and try to push that. Unless you have a major publisher behind you. Even if you make YouTube videos, there's a lot of that are on there that only have 20 views. So it's tough finding your audience. Everyone has an audience. For almost everything you make, there's an audience out there. But it's marketing. And I'm not really as much into the marketing as I am into the creation.
So I can't resist asking, in the context of a conversation about identity, when you go and read in America, you turn down the Canadianness. What are you turning down, and what are you turning up?
Well, see, it's like where the stool is right now is in the center, and I'm usually over in the left. So when I go to the States, I have to go a little bit over here. So I have to say things like guns aren't the most evil, or I just try to avoid the topic of guns. And like Trudeau itself, obviously he's a bit of an issue over here, but over there he's also an issue. So you try to avoid any references to the governments or stuff like that. Like there's even the way in which you talk. Like in Canada, we can rip on each other a little bit easier. The States gets a little more offended when you do that, especially their poetry reading groups and stuff. So you got to watch that. There's just different cultures. What you play too often in Canada is that we all sort of want to understand each other, and we work hard to do that here. And America has this brash individualism that you have to stand up and say, I can stand on my own. Don't need to buy my book. I'm doing fine. That sort of thing. But in Canada, they're like, oh no, man, let me help. I want to buy your book. So there's a little bit of a difference that goes on with those two.
I just wanted to acknowledge that Kitty Lewis, the general manager of Brick Books, who published both of these books, is in the audience, and these books are indeed for sale. Are there any other questions? Yes, Robin. Go ahead. There you go.
You alluded to motherhood is not...
It's not on, Robin.
There? Oh, sorry. There was a delay when I had the button at that setting, so I didn't. You alluded to the fact that motherhood, and you were careful how you phrased it, is not celebrated, or in poetry, that you noticed a difference. I think there was something hidden in that comment. Could you say more about that?
I don't think it's just in the Canadian literary scene. I think it's everywhere. So I haven't read it yet, but I have a friend who is reading a book right now. It's called The Invisible Woman or something like that. And it's a book on statistics and how women are excluded from statistical analysis categories. Sally Armstrong was talking about this too, but even in terms of simple things like transit mapping. So in Sweden, they did a study, like all their transit systems were set up for people who they thought were going to work, coming home, blah, 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 until they actually realized the people who are using the public transit are women, and sidewalks are women pushing strollers. So they actually, because they're Sweden and they do these things, they actually rejigged the system a little bit to be more accommodating. So, and specifically, I think in literary terms, there's an organization called the Creative Women in Literary Arts, and every year they do a census of how many books were written by women, how many books by women were reviewed, and how many women reviewers there are. And it's always overwhelmingly skewed in favor of men. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I know that, I mean, my books have all been kind of labeled under the domestic, as in it only deals with household things, right? Like, it's crazy making, because they're reading one surface of it and not all the thought and like reading and that goes under it. And so I never really expect my books to do that well because of that, to be honest. So I don't know. People might disagree with me, but I think as women, just in general, and then motherhood in particular, because nothing, like, I was listening to Sally Armstrong talk, and I think, okay, yes, she was saying it's about the person and personal will, but it's also about structure, like societal structure. Until we get affordable childcare, women are never going to make the same amount of money as men, and when they're out of the workforce, then they don't get promoted as quickly, and I think that's just on every level of our society right now. Thank you for asking.
With that, I'd like to invite you to thank DA Lockhart and Brenda Leifso.